Act 1 and Scene 2. A lot of reading tonight. I hope everybody's up for it. This scene introduces a whole new set of characters. And these are tradespeople, the kinds of people that Shakespeare liked to call rude mechanicals. And Shakespeare really loved these people, and he made fun of them, though, especially the pretensions and all their malapropisms and things like that, and he had a great time with it. He didn't laugh at them derisively, but he laughed about them. This group is a bunch of tradesmen that have gotten together as a amateur theatrical group, and they're going to rehearse a play, the play of Paramus and Thisbe, for Theseus's wedding. And Peter Quince is the nominal leader of the group, but Nick Bottom takes over while seemingly respecting the leadership. Each of these tradespeople has a name that's suggestive of his trade. Peter Quince is a carpenter, referring to quince wood, and Snug is a joiner, which we would call a cabinet maker, and the joints were called snugs. And Francis Flute is a bellows mender, and his name is after the flute of the bellows. Tom Snout is a tinker, after the tin snout of a teapot that would be made by the tinker. And Robin Starveling is a tailor, and this refers to the fact that tailors were almost legendary for their skinniness. Some even said they didn't cast shadows. And then there's Nick Bottom, who is a weaver, and that gets into something not quite so obvious. Weavers worked from the back side of their pattern. Whether it was just a simple weave or a tapestry, they always worked from the back side. And in ancient Persia, weavers were considered with very high regard, and the esotericists used them as references to the mysteries. It is well known that seers in the etheric realm see quite a few things backwards from the way they are in the physical realm. And it takes some adjustment to do that. At one time, many years ago, I had a conscious experience as an invisible helper, and I was in something that was like the war room at the Pentagon. And instead of having a map of the world, they had a map of the solar system, only they had other planets on there that went beyond the 10 that we use now. But because the experience was in the ethers, the names were inverted. And it was almost like a lucite panel. And I was trying to get around to the back side to read it, and every time I tried to get around to the back side, it was still inverted. There's the case of the famous Madame Blavatsky, who referenced books that were in forgotten vaults of the British Museum of Natural History. And she referenced books that nobody knew anything about, and they challenged her. And they checked out her quotes out of these books, and her quotes were accurate, but once in a while she had the page numbers inverted. So it's clear that she had some ability to read out of the ethers. So the whole idea of weaving a magic carpet with which one could fly through the air was a shorthand for talking about weaving the etheric soul body. And with that soul body, you could take your soul flights when you were away from the physical. There is that kind of reversal. And on an even deeper level, there is the reversal that takes place at the crux, deep in the mental realm, where the spiritual realms touch on the physical, and everything in phenomenal existence, our concrete thoughts, our emotions, is actually the inverse of the spiritual reality in the spiritual world. Some people refer to it as the difference between stamp and seal, and there is another reversal that takes place there. And if we're talking about an initiation, we're talking about the kind of consciousness that is thoroughly positive in the spirit as it works behind the world of archetypes, in which things are again backwards, where it sets everything spinning and then weaves the combinative archetypes together into everything that comes into existence. It's a world that is much more combinative than Legos are. Legos are very simple-minded by comparison. The reason I bring all of this up is because I can use help, and it's usually in these subplots where one finds the rude mechanicals or other fantastical characters that the esoteric information is hidden. It's often encrypted or encoded or such like that, and these things can very easily slip by me. And so if you see them, or if you note something unusual, either in the poetic structure or something like that, please point it out to me. I've learned a little bit about reading up and down lines to get sentences embedded in other sentences, but it's not easy to find that stuff. The misuse of the language begins at around line 11. Bottom asks Quince what the play is, and he says, "Mary, our play is the most lamentable comedy and most cruel death of Pyramus and Thisbe." He isn't talking about tragic comedy when he talks about a lamentable comedy. I think what Shakespeare is pointing to here is that there is something in simple minds that tries to dramatize things by modifying them by their opposites, and that a lamentable comedy would be a more a comic comedy than one that would be a lighter comedy. What happens is that Bottom has Quince call the role and assign the parts. Bottom is given the lead role, the role of Pyramus, who commits suicide for love, and he immediately responds with braggartry about it all. He says, "That will ask some tears in the true performing of it. If I do it, let the audience look to their eyes. I will move storms. I will condole in some measure. To the rest, yet my chief humor is for a tyrant. I could play Heracles rarely, or a part to tear a cat in, to make all split. The ravaging rocks to shivering shocks shall break the locks of prison gates, and Phoebus' car shall shine from afar, and make and mar the foolish fates." This was lofty. Now name the rest of the players. This is Heracles' vein, a tyrant's vein. A lover is more condoling. It's obviously that he's not a gentle lover, but much more fierce and much more tyrannical, and it's also obvious that he's not a poet. There might even be an encryption in that area. That's just the kind of place that he does it. Somebody else would like to read as they go through all the characters. Bottom feels he can play every part. Why don't I read the bottom parts, and then as we move on to others, I'll let other people read. Let's see. Along around line 52, Bottom says, somebody has to play Pyramus, and Bottom says, I may hide my face. I may have to play Thisbe too. Let me hide my face. Let me play Thisbe too. I shall speak in a monstrous little voice. Thisne, Thisne, Pyramus, my lover dear, thy Thisbe dear and lady dear. And so he wants to play that part, and later on he wants to play the part of the lion. Let me play the lion too. I will roar that I will do any man's heart good to hear me. I will roar that I will make the Duke say, let him roar again, let him roar again. And finally, at line 79, I grant you, friends, if you should fright the ladies out of their wits, they would have no more discretion to hang us. But I will aggravate my voice so that I will roar as gently as any suckling dove. I will roar as 'twere any nightingale. And yet in one other part, he says he wants to play someone else, and he says, I will discharge it in either your straw-colored beard, your orange tawny beard, your purple ingraden beard, or your French crown-colored beard, your perfect yellow. Obviously, he thinks he can play every part. It's interesting in this. Apparently, they did hair-dyeing things there if people had purple beards and all. That may go back to there was a belief in ancient Greece that true kings had a tuft of purple hair at the back of their head. I assume it was like a deep red of some kind, and this is the way that you could always tell a true king. Nick Bottom is an astrological archetypical character. Something of a cosmic standard. He represents a pure Aries, or a pure Mars positive. This is the type of individuality that identifies with pure energy. Energy that is unconstrained, unrestrained, and it's just purely expressed. Clearly, he wants to express it with tyrannical ferocity. He feels it. He'll have to rip cats apart like lions, or lions if he can. Since energy, when it's undefined, is explosive, or when it's uncontained, it is explosive and it goes in every direction. This is exactly the kind of consciousness that Bottom is signifying. I can do this, I can do that, I can do that. And it's true. Pure energy can do anything. And if you have your identity tied up in that, you recognize that. Aries represents the very beginning of the zodiac. And at the beginning of the zodiac, everything is undefined. And it can be used any which way. And that's what is shown in here. Moreover, if one identifies with energy, the only thing one respects is greater energy. And so there is something in the character of Bottom that he's willing to compete, to see who has the stronger energy at any juncture along the way. Well, we're breezing right along, but I don't think we'll be out of here in 90 minutes. I've given up my... It's a confession. So I might just turn around and get it all done because of the illness. So, in his overglow of enthusiasm, Bottom brags, and in all of his bragging, they point out to him that he spends his energy. But people who identify with energy have a philosophy that I can remember it myself. I had Mars in the first house. I can remember myself as a young man thinking that the more energy you spend, the more energy you get. Something like a well, that the more water you pump out of it, the more water that comes into it, and faster. And in this world of limitation, that isn't completely true, but there is some philosophy in it that is true. Attitude has a lot to do with our energy level, and the ability to recoup depends on having a positive, confident attitude that the energy is going to flow through us, and that we are foci, we are conduits or springs of energy. And it's really nice to see somebody like Bottom. Yeah, he's fantastic in all of his bragging and all, but it's really nice to be around people that have that kind of positivity. And it does have its effect. Clearly, because energy is as explosive and unrepressible as it is, it goes out, and it goes out in all directions. So it is doubtlessly extrovertive. And in any combination of people where you have introverts and extroverts put together, especially if they're young souls, the introverts, because they have a hard time wanting to and being able to externalize from themselves, they often believe that there is something better or something superior about the extroverts who can do that. And so we see that eventually, because clearly these players are all young souls, or the craftsmen are all young souls. We see as the play progresses, because Bottom is so extrovertive and so confident, and because he does his share of Aries browbeating. I didn't even get a snarl from the Aries at that. Because he does his share of that, by the end of the play, they do look to him as the authority and as the leader, whether or not he expresses good judgment. In that last, hey Larry. In that last part, there is the statement about the French moral temperament and the syphilis that accompanies it, which they call a French disease, and we won't go into the nationalistic or the culturalistic or racial slams. But the scene closes with all of the players agreeing to meet again at the Duke's Oak, which is in a little grove outside of Athens, which happens to be exactly the place where Lysander and Hermia are to meet. So Act 2, Scene 1 opens at just about that very spot in the woods outside of Athens, and it opens up with yet a third set of characters, a totally different set of characters, and different from characters in almost any other play, except going back to the Greeks. The Greeks had Erinyes and all sorts of other entities from the inner worlds, and this is a cast of fairies. It also opens with some lovely poetry, lines 2 to 18. Would somebody like to read that unnamed fairy's lines that talks about fairy activity. It begins with over hill. Is there anybody who'd like to read it? Want to read it? Do you have a book?
Over hill, over dale, thorough bush, thorough briar, over park, over pale, thorough flood, thorough fire. I do wander everywhere, swifter than the moon's sphere, and I serve the fairy queen to do her orbs upon the green. The cowslips tall her pensioners be, in their gold coats spots you see. Those be rubies, fairy favors, in those freckles live their savors. I must go seek some dewdrops here, and hang a pearl in every counselor's ear. Farewell, thou love of spirits, I'll be gone. Our queen and all her elves, come here and on.
Paul, would you like to read the part of Puck?
No, not tonight. I'm going to pass.
Oh, how could you? What a time to turn into an introvert. Do we have somebody that wants to be a... Larry, you want to be a Puck?
The king doth keep his revels here tonight. Take heed the queen come not within his sight. For Oberon is passing fell in wrath, because that she as her attendant hath a lovely boy stolen from an Indian king. She never had so sweet a changeling, and jealous Oberon would have the child knight of his train to trace the forest wild. But she perforce withholds the loved boy, crowns him with flowers, and makes him all her joy. And now they never meet in grove or green, by fountain clear or spangled starlight sheen, but they do square. That all their lives for fear creep into acorn cups and hide them there.
All right. We live in a very materialistic world right now. A materialistic world that prides itself in rationality, but it is a world that may have at least as many illusions and superstitions as the worldview which it succeeded. It claims to be a world of science and logic, but it is a very limited science and a very limited logic. And it has its own assumptions, which are superstitions. One of the illusions of that world is the illusion of death. We're not just talking about the death of a body, because that's an indubitable fact. We're talking about death in general, and the idea that a good part of nature is dead. Welded or wedded to this idea of death is a world conception that activities between objects and even within living objects occur by blind forces, and at best blind laws of nature, and that these blind laws of nature are interrupted by random chance events. This concept of blind laws of nature does not take into account that these principles, that these laws may not be blind, but they might in fact be the expression of very high and very perfect, consistent and regular intelligences, even to the single most law, the law of cause and consequence, that in itself might be the deepest kind of manifest intelligence. To mystics, there is absolutely no separation between spirit and its creations and its activities. Spirit is always with everything that is manifest from spirit. Whole idea of a void of separation between creator and creature, or better said, between creators and creatures, is just not a true outlook at all. And this is true at every level of existence. The elemental forces of nature, even in blind elemental activities, like evaporation and condensation of water in what we call weather, is not just blind. That it is the expression of an ongoing activity that is a vehicle of consciousness. Seers claim that some of the things that are carried out in small are carried out by very small beings that are made of life, vital life, and vibrant energy itself. Fairies, nature spirits. The seers say that their activities are carried out with love and with a very simple kind of consciousness. Somewhere in this store I have 2 books, which I probably won't sell you, but I'll loan you. One is called Nature Spirits and Nature Forces, which is a little teeny tiny book. It's by Max Heindel. And in it are descriptions of nature spirit activities. Another one is by Jeffrey Hodson, who is a delightful seer. It's called Fairies at Work and Play. Jeffrey Hodson was a seer from South Africa who became a theosophist and traveled throughout the world looking at nature spirits and grand angelic beings like that in the East are called devas, and he recorded their activities. And it's just fascinating. He has another book which I will soon have in the store, which is called The Kingdom of the Gods. And he has drawn, or he has painted, how it looks in the ethers, how the different nature spirits manifest. Then like a whole area, like a mountain, will be covered with one giant spiritual being, and within that will be other beings, and they're all carrying out the work of nature. All right, let's carry on. From where Puck left on, the other fairy guesses his identity. Who's our other fairy? Continue on from that point.
Either I mistake your shape and making claims, or else you are that shrewd and knavish strife called Robin Goodfellow. Are not you he that frights the maidens of the village ring, skim milk and sometimes labor in the clearing, and bootless make the breathless housewife churn, and sometimes make the drink to bear no barm? Mislead night wanderers laughing at their heart, those that hobgoblin call you and sweet puck, you do their work, and they shall have good luck. Are not you he?
Thou speakest the right. I am that merry wanderer of the night. I jest to Oberon and make him smile, when I a fat and bean-fed horse beguile, neighing in likeness of a filly foal. And sometimes I lurk in a gossip's bowl, in very likeness of a roasted crab. And when she drinks, against her lips I bob, and on her withered gullet pour the ale. The wisest ant, telling the saddest tale, sometimes for 3-foot stool mistaketh me. Then I slip from her bum, down topples she, and Taylor cries, and falls into a cough, and then the whole choir holds their hips and laughs, and waxen in their mirth and sneeze, and swear a merrier hour was never wasted there. But room fairy, here comes Oberon.
No, let's pass at this point. You gotta let me get some things in here. Egoist that I am, I have to have things to say. I don't know that because there are nature spirits that, as Puck is described and self-described, is exactly the way things happen in nature. I don't think there is necessarily a mischievous force that is having sport or fun. It may be that some things have to be carried out like that because that's the best way for us to learn our lessons, but I don't think that there are mischievous nature spirits or fairies. In fact, they're said to be quite innocent in their consciousness. A lot of this has to do with a barrier of ignorance that we have created in ourselves. We have our waking consciousness, and then there are things about us that we don't wish to admit to, and we repress them, which works very fine because they build a character and nature of their own, and they have their own little fiefdom within our soul. We sometimes call something like that a lower nature, and it thrives in repression, and it thrives in the shadow where it can't be seen. Sometimes, from deep beyond that, is the part of the spirit to which we are not yet awake. And it is that part of our being that is attuned and is actually a focus of the universal spirit, the divine shared purpose and creation behind everything. And it is trying to tame this about ourselves which we lie about, and it keeps pushing it to the surface. Even in our petty vanities. If we think too much of our hair, or with me, there used to be a time that I took great pride in certain ways of dressing, and every time I would have a really neat set of clothes on, I'd drop food on it or something like that. And you can't say that this is due to a mischievous spirit of nature, but you can say that deep within, something within me wanted to expose that kind of vanity. Now, it may be true that that may have to be carried out by a spirit of nature, and that spirit of nature may, realizing the good that's coming out of it, may enjoy it and may enjoy it with sauce. But you can't say that there's really that there's really a mischievous force in nature. However, it does make a good play, and a play is what we have. I get the principle of how this all works in nature, but I don't know that I have a good understanding of exactly the way it works. I am told that nature spirits function within the consciousness of an entity, usually an angelic consciousness, which in the Orient would be called a deva, and that in that energy they perform a function that is similar to the function of a cell in our body. But their consciousness is not individuated even in the same way that the consciousness of a microorganism is created. It's a sort of borrowed or induced consciousness that they have. So the elemental consciousness of elementals is really simple-minded, and it works by a principle of imitation. A lot of it takes place between self-conscious beings who see the nature spirits, and they produce some kind of argument of consciousness or some kind of communication, so that if a self-conscious being sees a nature spirit and this nature spirit is imitating that being, because the self-consciousness carries into the simple consciousness of the nature spirit, and it facilitates the mimicry, or it facilitates the show and tell. Like household spirits watch people sweep the floor, and then they manifest their little brooms and they sweep the floor. But to some extent, a lot of nature spirits, especially gnomes, are described with Atlantean wraparound eyes, like you see in Egyptian artwork, like the eyes that seem to go into the side of the head. And this goes back to the time in Atlantis when the cranial globe was not fully formed yet, and our eyes did have an appearance like that. And at that time, the people were still self-conscious seers, and in their interaction with the nature spirits, they took on those kinds of features. But I'm told by friends that are modern seers that Walt Disney and company have in fact really affected what fairies and nature spirits look like, and some of the fantasy notions of cartoonists have been taken on by nature spirits in the same way, like an innocent child will, put on mother's glamorous shoes and a glamorous dress, and they think they're all dressed up. You know what I'm trying to say? It's that innocent, aren't I pretty? I had a friend who had a child that acted out Dorothy in The Wizard of Oz every day when she was 3 years. Every afternoon she would scream if she couldn't have that. She'd plug in the video, and she had these red shoes that she could barely walk in, but she saw herself as Dorothy. And something like that is what the consciousness of the nature spirits is like. About this time, Oberon comes in as the king of the fairies, and he's got his whole train of fairies. And from the opposite side is the stage, Titania, the queen of the fairies, comes in with her attendants. And these are very interesting names, Oberon and Titania. They're really quite obscure. I'm astounded that Shakespeare even had access to them. There was indeed, in the history of mythology and folklore, there was indeed an Oberon that was king of the elves. But he doesn't come from Greek mythology. He comes from Franco-Germanic mythology. The first reference that there is anywhere that I know of an Oberon is from about the 5th or 6th century, when the Franks took over. The Franks were Germans, tall, blonde, blue-eyed Germans that took over France, and they founded the line of Merovingian kings. This brings up a very fascinating side trip. I'm just going to mention it if you want to go into it. There is a book called Holy Blood, Holy Grail, and it traces the notion that Jesus has blood relatives, and that Jesus was married to the woman that we call the Mary Magdalene, and that from that union there were several children who started the line of divine kings, and they are all associated with kings of the world, and they usually have something to do in their lineage with plants. So that the whole War of the Roses that Shakespeare writes about in the Henry and Richard plays is actually a story about the struggle of the two lines of the Plantagenets. That is the family of the plant source. In fact, that family still exists, and there are two people in the world that claim they can trace their blood lineage back to Jesus. One is a man in France called Pierre Plantard, who is the French version of a Plantagenet, and the other is, of all people, an Austrian named Otto von Habsburg. But what we're talking about, Holy Blood, Holy Grail, is a book that was written by two newspaper men, and it reads like something written by newspaper men. The thesis of it is very interesting. The proof of it is not very sound, but it brings out some really interesting ideas of the struggle back and forth to two sides of the expression of the Christ impulse in the Western world, which in its first expression came through the Merovingian kings, the Frankish kings who were supposedly through Joseph of Arimathea were the first descendants in the lineage of Jesus. It's a really, really interesting notion, and it ties into a theme that we're going to deal with a little bit tonight and more as the play progresses, and that is the India boy theme. The figure of Oberon of the elves in Germany and to some extent in France became something like a Merlin figure, locked in a tree and a magician and such, and it may even be the source of Merlin, because at about that time it made its way across the channel, and it did get into early English literature. And from there, Shakespeare may have picked it up. But it's a really obscure thing that he should know about Oberon as king of the fairies. Oberon in Germany eventually metamorphized and shows up in another mythology and cultural event. Oberon metamorphizes into the character of Albrecht, the tyrannical king of the fairies, or the king of the elves in Wagner's Ring Cycle. Now, Titania is much more obscure. After considerable research, some people have never found much of anything at all. The only reference to a Titania goes all the way back to the Orphic poet, mystery writer called Hesiod. And he wrote a Theogony, which is a very beautiful poem. We covered it a while back in the mythology class. It must have been about 6 or 7 years ago. And heaven and earth, Uranus and Gaia united, and everything came out of their creation. One of the sidelong things that came out of it were 6 daughters that were called the Titaniads. And in this sense, Uranus also is Uranus, the god of the electrical ether. And so the relationship of the etheric realm to the physical realm is the union of Uranus and Gaia. And supporting that, out of the first offspring would be the Titanids. So Titania would then be in a lineage going all the way back to when the physical earth condensed out of the ethers in what we call the creation of the planets early in the solar system. Now, that Shakespeare would know something like this is absolutely phenomenal. It argues for a real ability to get at the memory of nature, because this is really obscure. I got a pretty good mythical library, a library about mythology. I must have something like 50 and 80 books on mythology and folklore, and some of them are, highbrow, some of them are lowbrow, and I had to dig really hard to find that relationship. But at any rate, Titania and Oberon are having words. Would anybody like to be a Titania? Billy, you want to be a Titania? Who wants to be an Oberon? All right, Bob will be an Oberon. Yeah, can you pass back and forth with Millie, or? We'll begin at line 60 and go back and forth between Titania and Oberon until Titania exits at 145. So Oberon starts, ill met by moonlight. Do you have line references?
Ill met by moonlight, proud tarry, rash wanton, am I not thy lord?
And I must be thy lady. But I know when thou hast stolen away from fairyland, and in the shape of Torrens sat all day playing on flakes of corn and versing love, and thou hast spilled them. Why art thou here? Come from the farthest seas of India. But that, forsooth, the bouncing Amazon, your clustered whiskers, and the warrior love. Theseus must be wedded, and you come to give their bed joy and prosperity.
How canst thou thus, for shame, Titania, glance at my credit with
Hippolyta.
thou even through the glimmering night, from Virginia whom he ravished, and make him fairer Hippolytus break his faith with Adrene
Ariadne. Impressive. At the same time that Shakespeare was writing, in Japan they had a different kind of poetry. Shakespeare lived quotaneously with probably the greatest of the haiku poets, Matsuo Basho. And it is said that if you had 3 haiku that were accepted as true haiku, you were automatically a master. And Basho must have had 200. They're just phenomenally beautiful. But that speech, or the 2 speeches of Titania in there, are enough. You know, if he had never written anything else, it's enough to have qualified him as a master. Festivals of fairies are said to happen all over throughout nature. At midsummer, when the tide, at least in the northern hemisphere, when the tide of etheric energy is at its height and growth goes on unimpeded, the beings that carry out the work of life celebrate. And they actually do meet in special places and have dances and prepare foods and things like that. I don't know if those special places are PowerPoints. I suspect that someplace like Parfrey's Glen would be a place to go if you had enough purity to spend the evening and sit quietly and look for fairies. I've tried it out on several occasions, and my purity of character was not even sufficient to keep the mosquitoes away. To say nothing of being able to see fairies. What this indicates is that the fairies are apt to be found from anywhere from India to Greece or Parfrey's Glen. They're likely to be anywhere. They're carrying out their work. And they have childlike joy in success. There's nothing wrong feeling good about your creative work. And when the creative work comes out right, it should be celebrated. Now, I don't even know if there is such a thing as a king and queen of fairies. I've never encountered it anywhere beyond seers, except for the folklore, like the original Oberon, King of the Elves. But there's something that's really interesting in this to me. There's all sorts of little interesting things in here. We'll alone now before we get much back to the play. And that is the cross-gender support of fairies for Theseus and Hippolyta. Oberon is a supporter of Hippolyta, And he chides Titania for her support of the inconstant Theseus. And in doing so, she names all the people he has jilted. And among them is Antiope. So I had to go back to the books again this time around, trying, because I said that Shakespeare was in incorrect mythology in talking about Theseus marrying Hippolyta, and that at one time he did have a union with Antiope. And so I kept digging and digging and digging, and I did find a classic scholar from Scotland who equates Antiope and Hippolyta as being the same being, which is not the same as the Hippolyta that was queen of the Amazons that was slain by Heracles. So there is somewhere a connection between an Antiope and a Hippolyta. But Shakespeare, again, in this case, differentiates between the two, because he said this is a formal one that he jilted Antiope. So that Shakespeare is still on unsubstantiated grounds as far as mythological research is concerned. That's where people were interested in the stuffy scholarship. Some people really like to get into every little bit of Shakespeare. When Titania rebukes Oberon, she tells him that he's jealous, and that in his jealousy he's messing up nature. And she does it in that sweeping speech, really fantastic and beautiful speech. It's marvelous poetry, but I don't believe it's founded completely in mystic fact. Nature spirits do have character, and that character is part of their function. They identify with what they're doing. Goethe, the great German poet, has an article where he writes about chemical interactions. And in those chemical interactions, he talks about wars between the nature spirits that are identified with the qualities of each of the reagents. But they're not wars that are wars of hatred, but there are wars talking about an identification with the character, and in this struggle something is accomplished. In that little book called Nature Spirits and Nature Forces, Heindel talks about the battle between the sylphs and the undines. The sylphs being nature spirits associated with the gaseous element, with the air, vaporize the water and take it up into the heavens. The undines are associated with the liquid state, especially water, and when there is a storm, they fight with the undines to bring the water back in, with the sylphs to bring the water back in the form of rain. So it is true that there are struggles in nature, that there are forces that work counter to each other, and they act out their roles in order to accomplish things in nature, and there's really nothing wrong with that. But to state that the nature spirits have something personal and that they have jealousies that are causing the difficulties in nature, I don't think is quite true unless it's indirectly. What is probably more likely the source of difficulties in nature being aberrant is human consciousness. Because we do fight for keeps, and we do hate, and we do sin by trying to work against the purpose of nature to satisfy our own ends selfishly. And so it's not surprising then that when there are astrological conditions that make for weather, it's all tied together, it's not surprising that our response to those astrological conditions is to throw into the mix some very destructive attitudes. And we can indeed produce droughts and things of that nature. This shouldn't really surprise us, because in between lives, we are nature spirits. In a very high creative sense, we modify the world and the way nature is going to be when we come back to rebirth. We're part of the creative hierarchies, a very self-conscious part, in a very special way, because we're wide open in our conscious sense perception of external nature. So, we even have in our highest aspirations, we become magicians, so that we actually can instantaneously become creators within nature. So I don't think it is really wise to say that the nature spirits are fighting with each other. It again makes good drama, and it again means that they may be carrying out jealousies among human beings, but it would be very incorrect to say that the fairies are the cause of the bad weather around us. Now, it leads to another issue. Nature spirits also do not steal little children. Whether they have their headquarters in India or not, they do not steal children. The gypsies, who supposedly came from India, sometimes did steal children, but I don't think nature spirits do. So we have to look, I think, a little bit deeper in order to get at this theme of the Indian boy, because it's going to lead us eventually in the next talk or two to the deeper spiritual side of the play. We want to talk about battles in nature. One of the primary functions of the etheric realm is to support and report the experience in form in this dense chemical region. This dense chemical region that we're in is the end of the line. In this world in which we are preoccupied most of the time with our consciousness, things have been, from the depths of the spirit, externalized as far as they're going to be externalized. They're so externalized that this world is exclusively external. All we ever see is the outside of anything. And if we break it open, or cut it open, as we cut open a cadaver, all we see is another outside. We never see something inside. An animal, for example, if one dog sees another dog, the physical eyes see something outside. But inwardly, the animal sees the thing outside in itself. And with that inwardness, with that withinness, it senses the nature and the intent of that object outside. And it knows how to act, or to react, or to escape, or whatever. And that's not our case here. We as humans are so external that we have primarily an external consciousness, especially as regards our physical bodies. We might even be considered, as my friend Henry likes to say, monopolar, that we are externalized to one pole, outwardness. So much so that to even continue to do things in this world, the externalized poles have to be gendered. You can't do like plants do because plants still have a lot of inward consciousness and they can be male-female. And they can regenerate or it can generate new bodies because they have the male-female qualities. We have become so externalized and so polarized that in order to continue our physical existence and at the same time try to develop some inwardness so that we can progress, we have to be gendered and then cooperate in order to procreate and to go forward. All the other realms, the desire world, the mind, and the pure spiritual realms are inward. So that when one gets into the purely spiritual realms, it is only inwardness, and the effects of outwardness can only be apperceived in terms of an inward kind of consciousness. The ethers in which the nature spirits dwell and carry out the activities are polarized. They're more polarized than any other realm. This is because they represent a state between the inwardness and the outwardness. And so all of their functionality has this polar quality about it. This carries even into formations in the ethers, so that we in our monopolar experience as gendered beings in the external world are either male or female. But our etheric vehicles, our vital bodies, are polarized the opposite in order to maintain the balance and to be able to properly balance our whole being. So that outwardly my physical body is masculine when I take a masculine incarnation, but inwardly the etheric body is feminine. And this is a necessity, because women who have to bear children have to have the positive inward ability to build new bodies. So inwardly they are assertive, and their etheric bodies are so assertive that they can, working through the physical, carry children. This is, in alternate incarnations, usually, we go through these kinds of experiences. Psychologically, this bipolarity of our physical and etheric vehicles is also true. So that psychologically inward, in my inward nature, I am feminine. And this is why the first glimpse of the soul nature through which the Spirit speaks is always of the opposite gender. Little girls see Prince Charming, or little boys see the bride that comes from heaven. And so the first inward vehicle is a polarized vehicle. Beyond that, it is omnisexual. I mean, it's beyond polarization. This carries right into the psychology of Carl Jung. Carl Jung understood this quite well when he said the inward face of the soul has usually the opposite gender of the physical nature. He's talking totally about a psychological reality because he didn't like the idea of etheric vehicles and things like that. But his whole idea of an anima for every human being seeing their soul nature as a woman, it goes right along with this. So it's not surprising then that we find the fairies, this is symbolized in the favorites of the fairies. Titania supports Theseus, and Oberon supports Hippolyta. This carries on in our whole life. As we grow older, we become more soulful. Every time we sacrificially do good deeds, every time we appreciate nature or the beautiful lines of Shakespeare or something like that, we attract more soul material in our etheric vital bodies. So eventually they become thick enough so that we can reflect images in them and have an inward clairvoyance, and eventually thick enough so that we can separate them from the physical and have soul flights. But when that happens, the character of the personality changes. Older men become sweet, soulful old men, and older women become stronger and more robust and assertive. The etheric vital body, especially the higher ethers, the soul body part of it, is a vehicle for the spirit, especially for the life spirit. And we've gotten into trouble with the chain of command, so that things that come through thoughts and desires often get captured and waylaid by this false self, this lower nature that we've developed in us, and they don't always get through so that we can act appropriately. But the more that we have of the etheric soul material, the more the life spirit intuitions can hit directly on the ethers, and we can express immediately. This is really important, because we're coming to a time now that over many, many rebirths, more and more people are having richer soul bodies. And this means that eventually, when some new spiritual impulse is going to come to the world, it'll come instantaneously in everybody all over the world, because everybody will be rich in ethers and they'll pick it up. It didn't used to be that way. You know, there are instances, yes, Leibniz and Newton developed calculus at approximately the same time, because that discovery was right, and they discovered it instantaneously. It used to be that spiritual impulses would find a place on the world that was favorable to their development, and then they would migrate from there. Usually the spiritual impulses went upstream, because spiritual things just don't wallow along, they go against the grain. And so things used to begin, or at least for the last few thousands of years, they used to begin in Mother India. And so a spiritual impulse would begin in India, and going against the grain, opposite the direction of the rotation of the earth, it would move west. And so what we're getting at here is that the India boy represents something like an impulse that is carried through the ethers, that is passed back and forth between Titania and Oberon. The changeling in this case means not so much that they have kidnapped somebody and that they have an abductee, but it represents something that is changing hands back and forth. And this change happens in harmony with the cosmos. There are huge cycles, just like there are cycles of high pressure and low pressure, cyclones and anticyclones that happen in weather. There are cycles of change that take many thousands of years. One of them has to do with the precession of the equinoxes. The Earth wobbles on its axis opposite the direction that it revolves and rotates. One wobble takes 25,868 years approximately. We won't go into all of the science behind that, but one of the effects of it is that the equinoctial point, the point in the heavens that is exactly behind the sun, when the sun is exactly on the equator, appears to move backwards through the constellations. It's a very slow movement, so that its position in the stars moves 1 degree every 72 years. When the equinoctial point was in the constellation of Taurus. Worldwide, people worship the bull. The autumn equinoctial point at the opposite side represented the esoteric religion. And so the opposite side was in Scorpio, the sign of the serpents. And so whether it was the Nagas, or whether it was the Urias, or the Ophite cults in India, Egypt, or the Mideast, they were all serpent worshippers. When the equinoctial point moved into Aries, it was the time of the ram, and we had exceedingly daring architecture and things like that is Aries-like. And the opposite sign was Libra, which was the law and the prophets, as we know it from the Bible, or the seeking for the golden fleece on which to write down the laws of society. In our times, in the Pisces age, we have the religion of the fishes, and a priesthood that is made up of clerics, or of alchemists, or of virgins. Now we could go into, we're all familiar with this, and it would be tedious to go into it very much further. But there's one very simple point that we want to look at. The signs that correspond to the constellations, and the constellations themselves are very balanced. They alternate in order to maintain their balance. So some of the constellations and signs are receptive, and in their receptivity are said to be feminine. Some of these signs and constellations have a posture of assertiveness and of activity, and they're said to be masculine. This is another thing that we can go really far into. Humans, from the time of the separation of the sexes, there was also a separation in the soul that is permanent throughout all rebirths, such that some souls are in their nature masculine. They are called children of fire, children of Cain, or Freemasons, not necessarily associated with Freemasons, the free and accepted Masons. And the highest of them are the occultists. The others are feminine in nature. They believe in authority. They believe in receptivity. They are called the children of water, or they are called the children of Seth, or they are called Catholics, not necessarily associated with the Catholic Church. And the highest of them is called mystics. Each has a stance in the general populace, and each has a stance in esotericism. Now, it turns out that when the precession of the equinox, when the equinoctial point is going through a masculine sign, that then the priesthood, or the scientists, or the children of fire, and their magicians, and their hierophants are in power. When the equinoctial point is passing through a receptive or feminine constellation, then the priesthood and the line of authority and religion and devotion and acceptance becomes the way of things. So what we're talking about is that there is a passing back and forth of the spiritual impulse in order to maintain balance. And so that if there is an impulse that begins in India and moves to the West, it passes through the same quality of masculine and feminine. But it is not like a stoplight, where you come up to the line on the street and that's where you stop. There's a huge amount of overlap. But when passing from Aries to Pisces, Rome and Greece were already in decadence, and they were the height of the Aries age. well before the equinoctial point went into Pisces. And in Shakespeare's time, in the Renaissance, when there was an anticipation of the positive sign of Aquarius, which is coming up in the future, there was already the beginnings of a new scientific movement. And so, in the back and forth, there is the passing back and forth of the spiritual impulse between, in this case, the king and queen of the fairies. Now, we talked last time or the time before about the stages of a cycle, where there is first a steady growth, and then a rapid period of change, and then a period of quiescent incubation. All of the activity takes place in the period of rapid change. That's when the weather takes place, is when in the passage of a cyclone to an anticyclone or vice versa. But the same principles are involved. There's always a back and forth struggle. This is where drama occurs. So the passage of, it's not been pleasant between the Freemasons and Catholics during the passage of this inward spiritual impulse as it is passing from one to the other. All right. We'll finally get back to the text. There's going to be no major theme tonight, but we'll introduce that theory, and we'll come more to it in a little bit. We're at now line 146. Do we have who's playing Oberon? Oberon has something to say here. After Titania has left, Oberon says something. Well, go thy way. That's good enough right there. We've gone a step further than herbal lore. We've gone now into herbal magic. It's even further than herbal healing. But also, this is a really long talk, and I'm sorry for that. But I don't want to be here all year. And there's, like there are hundreds of themes that I'd love to go into, like the boy and the dolphin theme and all of those things, which actually works out in nature. Do you know every few years there is somebody that gets thrown off of a ship and is picked up by a dolphin and carried to land? It doesn't happen with everybody, but there are a few people that are carrying it. And it's a real deep mythological theme, and it has itself to do with initiation. So herbal magic. This is not, I don't believe, carrying lore too far. I think that there is a reality to it. It is subtle, but if we have the purity and the simplicity, such as the fairies have, I think that herbal magic can work on us. The shaft of Eros, Cupid, is perhaps something more than pretty poetry. It's probably a shaft of light. And if we run that shaft of light through a prism, we see that it gets broken up into 7 other shafts, 7 rays or 7 arrows. It doesn't seem far-fetched. In fact, there is scientific evidence that some plants thrive in some kind of light and do not do well in other kinds of light. It is like saying that throughout nature, as light passes over a given area of the woods, some of the plants are responding to some parts of it and other to other parts of it. People who are skeptic doubt all of this, but the psychology of the fact is there are psychological studies that show that different attitudes are found in people when exposed to light of different colors, especially if the exposure is for a long amount of time. It's saying like there are certain powers that are in certain colors, and we, even as human beings who are self-conscious creators, even we are influenced by them. So it doesn't seem, it seems like a straight line from light of a particular variety being specialized in an herb, and that herb having a magical effect on an individual according to that individual's propensity to respond to that kind of light or to respond to that kind of vibration. That's a very simplified statement, and it's not at all as elaborate as what Oberon is saying, but the pathway is open. And really a lot of things about magic and a lot of things about nature around us are not as far-fetched as we might think. What often happens in the non-acceptance of these things is, I think, that the same selfish egoism that closed us to insight, internal insight at what is called the fall of humanity, that now gets carried out into a closedness that we become skeptical. I can say from my own experience that the years that I was atheistic and was closed to everything were years that I was much, much more involved in intellectual pride and ego and things like that, and was carried away with ideas of being brilliant or something like that, and actually I was quite stupid. All right, let's just leave that sit for now. Love and idleness is said, at least in my notes, to be a pansy. And that's probably at least approximately true. Pansies are English violets, not like our American violets, but not too far away. In our own gardens, there's something like the Johnny Jump-Ups, the primitive pansies. And to this day, in all of our, to call somebody a pansy is to call them someone that is of a Venusian nature, that they're gentle and loving and kind and things like that. I have seen seeds for Love in a Mist in a catalog, but I don't know if they were authentic. But there are probably buffs that do have, hand-me-down seeds that probably go back to the original Love in a Mist, and you can probably get it. And this is at a point where I ask things of people. I'm open in looking for very good books on plant lore, tree lore, and herb lore. Not so much medicinal herbs, but more or less the myths and stories, either from traditions. If you run into such good books like that, look them over, and if they look really good quality, let me know. I'll gladly pay you for them. In this regard, this is one of the few arguments, since we're dealing with a few little scholarly things, one of the few arguments for Shakespeare having been Bacon. Because it's clear that Shakespeare knew an enormous amount of plant lore, which was a very strong point for Francis Bacon. In fact, Francis Bacon wrote a whole book about locating an island and exactly where it would have to be, and it would be a garden that would be perpetually flowering, that this would succeed this and would succeed this, and I wanted to have that kind of ideal garden, which anybody who has ever gardened has wanted to do. All right. Now, we need to have a new set of characters brought in here. I think if it doesn't cause a family feud by living the part too well, how about a Demetrius and Helena until the exit of Demetrius? Can you read? From line 189, I love thee not, Demetrius says.
The wildest hath not such a heart as thee. Run when you will, the story shall be changed. Apollo flies, and Daphne holds the chase. The dove pursues the griffin, the wild hind makes speed to catch the tiger. Bootless speed, and cowardice pursues, and valor flies.
I will not stay thy questions, let me go. For if thou follow me, do not believe that I shall do thee mischief in the world.
Aye, in the temple, in the towns, the field, you do me mischief. Fie, Demetrius, your wrongs do set a scandal on my sex. We cannot fight for love as men may do. We should be rude, and we're not made to rule.
Yeah, that's...
I'll follow thee and make a heaven and hell to die upon the hand I love so much.
I have small hands. And I believe the palmists, when they say people who have small hands tend to take on tasks that are much too big for them, and, and tasks that go on and on and on. It's all right if you're an eternalist, which I happen to be. It means I'm never going to give up on anything. So what we're going to do is we're going to start on a topic that we may not ever come back to for years, or we may come back to it later in this series of talks. And it is, again, a small hands topic, meaning that the topic is huge, huge, huge. And we're going to just take a few very simplistic opening thoughts, and I hope they aren't so simplistic as to be repulsively simple. So we'll just say a little bit now. This is the philosophy and psychology of love and relationship. We're going to look at it in an extremely amateurish way, almost in street language. Helena's speeches are certainly not the product of a healthy psychology. In fact, to be in love in the way that she is in love is probably not a healthy psychology. Even if we allow for dramatic effect or for poetic license, these swoons of love, it's still not healthy. But even though it's not healthy, it's certainly not uncommon. With regard to romantic matters, humans seem to be very unhealthy, and this kind of situation comes up very frequently. Last time we talked about an astropsychology of the tendency of men to conquer and move on. Helena's response to this is a natural response that has to do with what we experience when we reincarnate into a feminine body. When we reincarnate into a feminine body, we're under a much stronger astrological influence of the moon and Venus. They provide the tendency to not only receive, but to actually draw out and to nurture and to perfect the way people interact with each other. Nurture and perfection are very long-term activities, and they require enormous amounts of care and love and concern. if we try to say that Helena, as she says herself, is drawn to or has this kind of concern, kind of consciousness, if we take that as an expression of the Venus-Moon kind of psychology, that's certainly not enough. It's just not enough to say that we're attracted. That doesn't give us enough understanding. So we'll try to go into it with a little bit of cosmology, and I'm going to have to move very swiftly because I don't want this to take too long. In classic mysticism, East and West, we are in the middle of a 7-stage cosmological process. We are in the 4th stage, which is called the Earth period. Previous to this, in a stage that was called the Moon period, is when we developed our desire bodies, our auric vehicles through which we express emotion, desire, passion, feeling, mood, all of those kinds of qualities. Everything in the evolutionary creation happens harmoniously. So in that moon period, the character of the moon is stamped in the very nature of our desire bodies. Before we can experience any emotion, we have to have a feeling. And the moon represents the mistress of feeling. All moods and emotional excitability, all of those things, you can be the most beginning astrologer and point to the moon in somebody's horoscope, and you can characterize very exactly how they go about their emoting and feeling, even in the beginning, very, very beginning work. In this desire body, there are 2 forces. We've talked about them before. In the lower regions of the desire body, there are the martial forces of self-assertion. You reach out and you take this is mine. And it has a repulsive effect. Throughout the desire world, but especially in the higher regions, is the self-sacrificial, loving, Venusian quality. And when something sacrifices its own nature rather than self-asserting, it gives. And in so giving, it attracts. So basically, in the simplest way possible, our relationship to desire is one of attraction or of repulsion. We can see that the statements of Demetrius are consistently statements of a conquering repulsiveness. Even if other people haven't been repulsed yet, he's repulsed. I've overcome and I'm sick of you. I don't want to see you anymore. But even if this is a true observation, she is clearly attracted to him, and she would sacrifice in every which way. But there still really isn't a deep enough or a thorough enough understanding. I don't know if we'll ever get to one, but this understanding is sort of like saying shit happens because of the attractive and repulsive forces of the desire world. It's still basically a shit happens kind of outlook. Motivation and desire are extremely object-oriented. They are all related to particular objects. We are drawn to or repulsed from an object. whether it is self-assertion or whether it is self-sacrifice, whether it is aggression or whether it is love, it is still attraction and repulsion. The difference between the attractive and repulsive forces relative to the object is the intention. One wants to give to the object, one wants to take from it or to take the object itself. However, after many millennia of manifesting desires and manifesting them with a cast of selfishness on our light of consciousness, the intent gets built right into the character of the vehicle. Our vehicles are direct expressions of the divinity that condenses them and uses them. Our physical bodies, with all of their resistance, are the direct vehicle of the will which holds or gets traction from that resistance. And so, the character of how we are motivated, what our intent is, eventually gets built right into the nature of the vehicle. So that if we are selfish, fallen human beings, over many millennia, it becomes a habit. And our desire bodies become habitually self-assertive or habitually repulsive. And if we think that we're going to become saints overnight, or if we think that we're going to change into being benign people overnight, it just isn't so. Even if we develop almost miraculous capacities, it still takes a long time to completely regenerate each and every one of our vehicles so that they no longer have the, in the case of the desire body, habitual selfish intent. It's something that takes a long time. So, when we see things and we have this martial quality, when we see something, we want to reach out and grab it. Or like Mars in the Iliad, when things get hard, he runs off the battlefield like a big chicken. The Venus desires, Venus in Taurus needs something to love. Or Venus in Libra needs someone to love, someone to sacrifice. Of course, all the other planets enter into this and give it all sorts of hues and tints and shades, so that this is an extremely simplistic way of talking about it. But we have, by habit, built into our desire nature an autonomous false being that thrives on desire. When it gets stymied, whether its approach is assertion or whether it is attraction, the desire force builds up just because it can't fulfill its quality. You might say that entity or that being, our desire body, has a nature that is all its own. It just revels in desire, any kind of desire, and it gets stronger in that. When it is denied, it builds up in energy that becomes exceedingly strong. In street language, when we're talking about Helena, we're saying that she has a forbidden fruit syndrome. She has the desires have not had their chance to be manifest. They're frustrated and they build up and up and up. However, she is selfish, and so there is something inverted. It's very clearly when she says, let me be your spaniel and you can beat me or do whatever you want. Even if you're looking at this as a forbidden fruit syndrome, this is still not healthy. So we have to go a little bit deeper than that. Everything that we said is of the character of the desire body, and all of these things are true, but I don't think it's really deep enough to be able to give the answer to it all yet. This is a particular syndrome that I've seen a lot of it. I've experienced it myself, but the way the syndrome manifests is different when you're born in a male's body and when you're born in a female's body. I have spent many, many hours counseling with people who are subject to this syndrome, and it doesn't make any difference whether it's male or female. And Landers addresses it all the time. I've heard it on talk shows, and it's a very common way it goes. I'll state it in a simple way, again, almost like street language from the male's point of view. It goes something like this. Guys say that they're serious in their intentions, and they would like to be right with a woman, and they would like to get together with her, and despite all of their protestations of ethics and of wanting to be with a woman, and the protestations of the woman that she's really looking for a nice guy, a woman will say, I find him boring, and instead prefers the excitement of a bad boy. Even if I've seen cases of this where someone was a feminist, and in feminism thought at least in terms of equality of the sexes, but yet fell for bad boys and became like a spaniel to a bad boy, because there's more excitement and less boredom. You know, we're not talking of all cases between males and females. We're talking about something that usually happens more in younger people and in people who are emotionally immature. Women seem to be very forthcoming about this, and they'll say it's true. I've heard numerous cases on radio talk shows where they'll say, I'm with this guy, I love him, we have a great marriage, he's a good father and everything, but he's boring, and there's this other guy that when I look at him, you know how it all goes. The same thing happens with men, but for some reason, at least in my experience, men seem to be less forthcoming about the fact that despite all their protestations of trying to be the nice guy, they're really looking for a babe. You know what I mean? That they pass up women who are nice women and who are compatible with them and somebody that they can talk to, and they get irked when they can't at least find the baby in the woman that they're attracted to. And when this happens, the guys are obviously competitive with the Mars spirit of self-assertion, and they're jealous about the guys that are the chauvinists. So it is a two-way street. If it happens to be two people who are both seeking out the bad person, it turns out to be a tremendously destructive thing. I'm sure we've all seen that. But most often it turns out that one is into this side of the syndrome and not the other. So Helena is obviously in this kind of a pattern. Now, Plato, in his, Plato's Socrates, you don't know which is which, in the dialogue called the Lysis, Socrates, or Plato's Socrates, avers that we make a big deal of our lovers and we put them up on the pedestal and we let them get away with everything because we want to build them up. not so much to put ourselves down. That can be a side effect, and one can get into that sub-syndrome. But we want to build them up, because then when we've conquered something, we've really conquered something. It's not like, like we're equal, and hey, we can be friends, and we can be very, very plain spoken with each other. So this sounds very much like Mars, or the inverted of the Venus moon in Helena. Now this Platonic view, this is only one of Plato's views. He has a number of views on love, and all of them are extremely beautiful. Several of them are in the Lysis, and others are found in the Symposium. The spiritual love that that Socrates expresses in the Symposium is very sublime. But this makes sense. The reason that we want the bad person is not only because our desire bodies can revel in that and live in that kind of truth, but we want the bad guys or the bad girls because in epitomizing them, we increase or we strengthen that nexus of a pseudo-self or a lower nature in our own desire world, in our own little desire body, so that in our egoism, it turns out that we're strengthening our little bastion of our selfhood, and this isn't really love at all. In fact, when one does experience a healthier love later on in life, or maybe a few lives further on, I talked myself into weakness. This kind of love disappears altogether. All right, those are some opening statements, and we'll probably talk more on that subject altogether. The scene ends with Oberon instructing the Puck when he returns what to do with the herb, and he says, "I pray thee, give it me. I know a bank where the wild thyme grows, where ox lips and the nodding violet grows, where quite over canopied with luscious woodbine, with sweet musk roses, with eglantine. There sleeps Titania sometime of night, lulled in these flowers with dances and delight. And there the snake throws her enameled skin weed wide enough to wrap a fairy in. And with the juice of this I'll streak her eyes and make her full of hateful fantasies. Take thou some of it and seek through this grove. A sweet Athenian lady is in love with a disdainful youth. Anoint his eyes, but do it when the next thing he espies may be the lady. Thou shalt know the man by the Athenian garments he has on. Effect it with some care, and he may prove more fond of her than she upon her love. And look thou meet me ere the first cock crow." All right, next time we'll continue on from there. I promise you we'll get a full act done without too many egregiously long side trips. I'll try to promise anyway. Yeah, I like everybody reading. Everybody gets to participate. This is really a pretty play for the poetry that is in it. It's very, very sweet poetry. Oh, I read a wonderful poem last night. I'm reading through the complete, or not the complete, but most of the great poems of Jorge Luis Borges. I'm trying to read them in both Spanish and English. And in this poem, he describes his fear of mirrors. And he says why this fear is so common is that we're afraid that we ourselves in our essential nature might be nothing more than a reflection. And that's profoundly deep, because in a spiritual sense, that's what we are, is we're an idea, a reflection in the consciousness of the divine, our self-natures. And it's really, and the way he writes the poem, lovely use of rhyme and all sorts of things like that, but I've got to quit or I'll go on and on and on. Thank you very much, and